Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, Caspar and Tim. Thank you for coming along. It's wonderful to be here at this conference in this most beautiful location. Thank you also for your welcome, as I'm not somebody who is a specialist in the history of religions or esotericism. I'm a history of art and design person or a visual and material culture person. But I'm going to be talking to you today about a place or a set of people where some of those ideas intersect. So the subject of my talk today is a group founded in England in the 1920s, who had about 1,000 members and who lasted for around a decade, and they were called the Kindred of the Kibbo Kift. And this is a group about whom I've written a book, lots of articles, curated an exhibition. I've been mildly obsessed with them for about a decade. And as the theme of this conference is about the intersection of art, politics and the occult, I'm going to argue in my presentation that this group, Kibbo Kift, represents an embodiment of the entanglement of those three areas. And in fact, in their own time, the group's purpose was their unification. If you're not familiar with this group, I will be telling you all about their practices and their purposes, but I'm going to draw on some particular themes in the group's approach, which is specifically Kibbo Kift's claims about the magical agency of art and design and of image and symbol, which, as I'm going to show you, they considered to be purposeful, operative, and even animate. And those assertions simultaneously drew on Hermetic traditions and the mystical modernism of the 1920s. And they find echoes too, I think, in our own time and in our own interests, in philosophies of new materialism, and in the magically invested practices of some forms of contemporary art. So, as such, I'm going to offer a historic example of how to think with enchanted things. So, to begin, if you were out for a walk in the hills and the lanes of the southeast of England on any weekend in the 1920s, you might have chanced across this striking group of hikers dressed in hooded cloaks of Lincoln green, perhaps marching in triangular formation, sometimes singing songs of their own composition. And the first inkling that you might have had that this was no ordinary group of outdoor enthusiasts might have come if you stopped to say hello and you were greeted in Anglo-Saxon or in the new international language of Esperanto, or introduced to members by names such as Blue Falcon or Deathwatch Beetle. And if you were invited back to camp, the sight of members in their ceremonial costume with their carved staffs and their painted tents might have convinced you that this group was, in their own words, a confraternity of elites and not a tennis club. So, the Kindred of the Kibbo Kift, this is what I'm going to be talking to you about for the next 40 minutes or so. They were founded in 1920 by a dissident Boy Scout leader and a commercial artist called John Hargrave, also known by his Kibbo Kift name of White Fox. This is him in his green hooded jerkin and also at his easel. And Kibbo Kift was made up of all ages membership, mixed gender membership, a merry band of spiritual seekers, educational experimenters, creative practitioners, natural health campaigners, and social reformers. And they gathered around a set of philosophies that were informed as much by the post-war League of Nations as they were by Scouting. And they had an ambitious 7-point covenant that combined egalitarian reforms to education and economics with interests in health and handicraft, camping and campaigning, myth and magic. They called for the complete reformation of industry along craft lines, the radical redistribution of wealth, the implementation of a world language, a world currency, and a fully representative world government, all in pursuit of nothing less than world peace. And they were endorsed at the outset by a wide range of very high-profile international figures across the arts and sciences, including Nobel Prize winners, polar explorers, international youth leaders, and former suffragettes. And although their methods and their styles in retrospect might seem somewhat outlandish or peculiar, at times they cultivated a mass appeal. They saw themselves as the leaders of the new world, which they thought was destined to emerge from the ashes of the last. They anticipated a certain collapse of civilization. At other times, however, they were keen to remain as a select group, and even perhaps obscure group, of self-identified magico-political visionaries, characterized by the qualities written into their name. So these words, Kibbo, Kift, these unfamiliar words, Kibbo, Kift, that is from a local Cheshire colloquialism, so an Old English colloquialism. They had found it in an antiquarian dictionary, and it means proof of strength. So for this brotherhood and sisterhood of the strong, whose membership was mostly lower middle class, white-collar workers, often teachers and civil servants, and most strongly clustered in the south and the southeast of England, that strength was physical and it was mental, but it was especially spiritual. So camping and hiking were kind of key practices. There's an outfit and a costume for every one of their practices. This is the camping costume, the hiking costume. But their strength was also spiritual. So given the focus of this event, it's that aspect of the group that I'm going to draw on today. It's just one of many multifarious strands. And I'm going to draw on how that spirituality was made manifest in their visual and material culture. So how that operated in the group's own conception as a cult spells for social change. So all of Kibbo Kift's practices, even at the most mundane level, were steeped in a sense of mystique. They were all performed on the body through dress and gesture. And their ceremonial approach to, to group organisation provided an alternative to the kind of military drill approach of scouts or to the conventional committee methods of other social reform organisations. Kibbo Kift's practices were often informed by theatrical rituals, often, always, in fact, original, or a kind of original mashup, I think, an original synthesis of other things. And those rituals and ceremonials were often secret, but they were all devised to lend a sacred quality to all aspects of group life, from the making and breaking of camp to the lighting of a fire. And I'm here showing you a couple of members in their ceremonial costume, variously in the kind of priestly robes of the 7 strong inner order of the Kibbo Kift, or as a poetess, a poet role holding a scald totem on the right. So the Kindred drew on mythology and folklore and symbolism, which was sourced from a very wide, geographically wide and historically diverse set of cultural and spiritual traditions. And these informed the new identities that members took on. So with their handcraft totem staffs and their symbols representing their new names and their new identities, their spirit animals and their mythic alter egos. So here's a couple of surviving examples of some staff heads. On the left, one by Blue Falcon, and on the right, the Ankh symbol of Angus Og. And these were the symbols of Kathleen Milnes on the left and Angus MacBain on the right, 2 of the most talented artists and photographers in the group. So the meaning and symbolism were found from locations around the world, but as a group based in England, they had a very particular mystic attitude to ancient English traditions. And these ancient English traditions were moved into characteristically new forms. So hikes to historic sites, such as Old Sarum, to chalk hill figures, to stone circles, and so on, were reconfigured as pilgrimages to places where the old gods could be venerated and even animated anew. And site-specific performances, choreographed photographs, and new creative productions, such as these stitched banners of the place. This is the Long Man of Wilmington, a chalk hill figure in Sussex. These combined futuristic stylings with imagined pasts. And at those holy places and at those high places, acts of neo-pagan salutation were performed. But what was it that was actually being worshipped? Sometimes it seems to me that it was Kibbo Kift itself, as seen in this sculpture of a genuflecting, hooded kinsman holding aloft the Kibbo Kift symbol, which was known as the mark. And the organisational use of the mark shares some similarity with 21st century total brand vision. It reinforced group identity when it was embroidered onto cloaks, when it was tooled into belts, when it was enamelled into cufflinks, and when it was hammered onto buckles. So it was an advertisement and it was a promotional device, but it was also a hermetic key and a company trademark, all at the same time. And the K symbol, which of course abbreviated the group's name, but which evoked the ancient Egyptian word ka for energy, was said to represent a man standing upright in the attitude of worship, that is, with one hand stretched to the earth and the other towards the sky. And again, this was baked into bread, it was baked into ceramics, it was waved on flags, it was cast in shadows on Stonehenge, and it was danced naked on the ancient Neolithic earthwork that is Silbury Hill. Induction into Kibbo Kift was a kind of initiation, and combined with the newness and the strangeness of kin costume and symbolism and language, the overall effect was otherworldly. Hargrave and many other kinsfolk found spiritual sustenance in the Kindred. But like all of Kibbo Kift's operations, however, its belief system could be hard to understand by the uninitiated. And a consequence of this was that Kibbo Kift earned a reputation as something of a cult. And certainly its enthusiastic embrace of non-Christian and non-European ritual was as controversial in its period as was its non-segregated camping practices, its skimpy exercise costumes, seen here. Its plain-spoken modern ideas about birth control and sex education, for example. Kibbo Kift leaflets regularly emphasised that every member is a living piece of propaganda. And one of the main ways that their message was carried was through their distinctive costume, or as they prefer to call it, their habit. See here these extraordinary wide shoulders, these robotic shoulders. Hargrave made his dislike of so-called civilised everyday dress well known. He argued that everyday dress caused illness by preventing access to fresh air, sunlight, and cold water. And he argued instead for the pleasures and powers of nakedness and dressing up. And he encouraged what he called picturesque clothing instead of the insane bowler hat, the insanitary trousers, and the ugly-coloured, badly designed clothing of our townsfolk. In his 1927 book, perhaps the sort of fullest flowering of his philosophy, the Confession of Kibbo Kift, it's called, Hargrave argued, I'm quoting him here, in every country, folklore and myth abound in references to groups of god heroes, which in many cases represent deified men. End of quote. And he included models from the Duk Duk Society of the Bismarck Archipelago, the Midi Society of the Ojibwe Indians, Druids, Persian Magi, Babylonian astrologers, and ancient Egyptian priests. And Hargrave concluded that such a lineage continued, he said, now the Kindred has appeared in England. And Hargrave admitted he had stolen the magic, as he called it, from wherever he saw fit. And that included 15th century Illuminati to the Knights Templar. Of all sources, he was most inspired by Rosicrucianism as a mystical secret brotherhood of the Middle Ages. As highly illuminated men, the Brethren of the Rosy Cross were famed as the keepers of hidden mysteries. And Hargrave positioned Kibbo Kift as an equivalent society of operative philosophers, intent on bringing what he called the universal and general reformation of the whole wide world. As seen in the mystical insignia of the group, another couple of banners here, Hargrave and many of his followers had extensive knowledge of world religions and historical spiritual systems, as well as 20th century esoteric practices, and those who did not have it were expected to acquire it. So Hargrave urged, "I expect," he said, "every kinsman over 15 or 16 years of age who hears such words as Al-Quran, Gautama, Tao, prayer wheel, I am, Vedic, taboo, Shinto, symbolic, alchemy, Zoroastrianism, to know to what they refer and to be able to fit the meaning into the general development of human ideas." So to know what these terms meant was just one part of the religious practice of the group. Kibbo Kift itself was also framed as a kind of religious practice. So early leaflets explaining what the organisation was through a series of frequently asked questions addressed this issue head-on. Is it a religious movement? One of the questions asked. Yes, was the answer. Other questions asked, is the group a kind of secret society? But the answer was no. Hargrave elsewhere stated, "Let those who turn tables, read thoughts, speak with tongues, gaze into crystals, and do other operations of a like nature turn away. There is nothing for them here. This is no mystical cult, a cult clique, nor magical fraternity," he said. But, in paradoxical style, he also asserted that the operative magus does not proclaim his initiation, disclaims occult powers, and says he knows nothing. So, in detailing and then dismissing those occult powers, I feel Hargrave highlighted in plain sight his extensive inside knowledge. And those practices, the practices of Hargrave's inner circle, also undermine those public claims that his organisation was nothing like a secret society. For via private rituals conducted monthly at the full moon and also in the mysterious taboo tent at kin gatherings, Hargrave's most trusted friends were initiated through elaborate death and resurrection rituals into what was described as a holy order to carry out the great work. And this term, great work, was used publicly as a way of describing Kibbo Kift's ambitious reformist aims, but it had its origins in occult texts, as many of you will well know. So Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic, Its Doctrine and Ritual, was a frequently cited text in Hargrave's library. And so the great work then was magical as well as practical, and this was explicitly spelled out in the Initiate's guidebook known as the Lodge of Instruction, which used occult phraseology throughout, as you can see. And ideas in that text drew on authors such as Levi, such as Lewis Spence, president of the ancient Druid order, and they mingled with rituals and terminology adapted from Freemasonry, from the Order of the Golden Dawn, and from Theosophy. And several prominent Kibbo Kift members were committed Theosophists, including the former suffragette, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, and member of the Advisory Council, Baron van Pallant, who was a Dutch scoutmaster and who in the 1920s had to decide where to leave, who to leave his substantial fortune to. He was torn between Hargrave and Krishnamurti, and that's Theosophy's appointed world teacher, of course. Unfortunately for Kibbo Kift, Pallant chose Krishnamurti. And in Hargrave's occult paintings, in that same manual, The Lodge of Instruction, these paintings, which seem to me to owe a debt to Kandinsky and to theosophist thought forms, the ordinary untrained mind visualized on the left contrasts with the trained mind, the one-pointed, focused and trained mind which is visualized on the right. And members were told, we can find 1,000 people who can pitch out a tent and camp for one who can pitch out his mind and think. So Hargrave practiced yoga and meditation, and he encouraged Kibbo Kift members to spend time in regular disciplined solitude. And he warned them, if you cannot bring yourself to give 5 minutes a day to self-conscious meditation in order to train the mind as a muscle, you will never understand the KK, he said. You are the Kibbo Kift. Know thyself. And all Kibbo Kift visual culture, however cryptically, visualized the world that they wished to magically bring into being. And a good example of this is the Herald surcoat. This is a surviving example of costume in the Museum of London, and this is a front and back view of the same garment. And it has symbols of place, peace, and life. So sort of starting from the left-hand side, we've got burying the hatchet, Mappa Mundi, the medieval world map, the splitting of cells in the creation of life, and the tree of life. And above that, Kibbo Kift's organizational logo, the mark, and then on the other side, this red ellipsis, the sign of the parted lips, and this was to signify the role of the wearer, so it was worn by the herald who made announcements in camp. And that symbolism infused absolutely everything, from rucksacks to tents. This is perhaps the world's most beautiful tent. You had to make your own everything. You had to decorate your own everything. So make your own tent, paint your own tent. And they all had to be decorated with original symbolism. So symbols were used because of their relation to ancient forms of communication, but Kibbo Kift's graphic method also used modernist language, so pictograms, ideographs, and logos, alongside influences that came from Cubism, Constructivism, and Vorticism, with further details added from heraldry and Timeticism. And Hargrave deliberately called his encryptions sigils, although he never referred by name to the artist Austin Osman Spare, whose sigil magic preceded him, and who may well have been known to Hargrave in the very small circles, the occult circles of interwar London. The purpose of Hargrave's sigils was similar. They were also symbols that operated as condensations of thought for the government of energy. So all Kibbo Kift artifacts, I think, are thus invested objects. They are all charms. They are all ritual tools. So as living propaganda, the clothes that the members wore and the banners that they waved were central to the group's messaging. And they were designed not only to embody belief, but also to attract attention, which they did, especially from the press, and to ignite curiosity. So people would stop them, start conversations, and those conversations would lead to the revelation of the organization's core pursuits: pacifism, natural health, egalitarian economics, and the restoration of spiritual values to a material world. And Hargrave was a very talented publicist, and he was a trained one. He earned a regular wage by working for an advertising agency, and this is key, I think, to understanding their aesthetic. And some of the dominant commercial styles of the 1920s consequently show up in the organization's material culture, and I'm making an example here, a comparison between a much celebrated modernist advert for Chrysler Cars by Ashley Havenden, the famous graphic designer, and one of the Kibbo Kift banners, which was used by their kind of transport section. And that aspect, that combination of modern advertising with this kind of mystical ideals, these mystical ideals, encapsulates for me one of the many, many, many contradictions in Kibbo Kift. So they rejected what they called so-called Charlie Chaplin civilization, they called it, but they also drew on modern stylings, the modern stylings of the emerging practice of public relations. So they drew on both the antiquarian and the futuristic, the spiritual and the material, the anti-capitalist and the commercial. And much of Kibbo Kift's dismissal of modern life was based on its artifacts. So bowler hats and trousers, we've heard, were much disliked. They were signs, they said, of a death-dealing rationalism. And similarly, in interiors, stuffed birds and antimacassars and lace curtains, the kind of trappings of stifling suburbia, where, in fact, most members lived, but from which they desperately wanted to escape, these were symbols of objects to be cast off and cast out. And there's a really striking passage in the Handbook of Occult Instruction, which shows to me how even the most mundane objects could be infused with spiritual aura if they were understood as part of a vitalist worldview. And through a paratactic list of modern miscellanies, Hargrave argued for the spiritual immanence and the atomic kinship of all things. And this approach, he said, means that teapots, chairs, mud, electric light bulbs, fingernails, hammers, steam engines, mountains, hats, shoes, needles, tram tickets, lilies, telephones, tents, dynamos, walking sticks, cow dung, churches, iron foundries, neckties, cats, human beings, steel plates, bricks and mortar, glass, sealing wax, trees, thoughts, tables, music, flower and flower pots, clouds, gutter gratings, books, food, buttons, machine guns, beads, rain, clocks, boots, ferro-concrete, eggs, sunlight, coal, stars, solar systems, slugs, pictures, maggots, wheel bolts, smells, darkness and light, collar studs, speech, seeds, birds, bootlaces, insects, skeletons, peppercorns, babies, space, time, matter, all religions, all spirits, all matters, all are actually the one great power. I feel like I've evoked something. Something happened then. Everything went very quiet. So this oneness was absolutely central to all of Kibbo Kift's philosophies, and it drew on new thinking in biology, especially where science seemed to confirm the wisdom of the ancients. And in another illuminated manuscript, this is the Kinlog. Wow, this is an incredible thing. I had it in my exhibition. It is about that big and that wide. It's got this leather-tooled cover. You heave it open onto a specially designed lectern, which had a kind of crouched, hooded kinsman holding it up. And there was a special uniform to be worn when reading this Kinlog, and there was a special pointer to point to the various elements on the page. So it's this incredible document with a hand-tooled cover, hand-painted pages, and it was designed to record the official Kibbo Kift story for historians of the future. So it was written for me. It was waiting for me. It was waiting for all of us. But one page in that text, in that Kinlog, is particularly revealing. And this is the page I'm showing you here. So amid saga meter text and in a typical Kibbo Kift medieval modernist hybrid style, up in the top right-hand corner, there's a classically robed artist, a gas mask-clad scientist, and a bearded philosopher. And together they collectively grasp the three-edged sword of truth that will unite their various elements. And below them, emerging from a mass of a tangled flow of ideas, is this green hooded stylized kinsman. And he's emerging from this kind of tangle of ideas, and he's supported by a wreath of figures that showcase Kibbo Kift's intellectual inspirations. And among those ancient Greek, Egyptian and Chinese masters and sages, one figure stands out temporally and spatially, and that's of Henri Bergson. So the then contemporary French philosopher's neo-vitalism, which suggested an unknowable and invisible force at the root of all living things, and which reinserted spirit into a mechanistic world, was a key Kibbo Kift's touchstone. An exposition of Kibbo Kift's philosophical basis, which they published in 1925, claimed that phrases such as dead matter and inert matter have gone by the board in modern science. The understanding that atomic energy coursed through all material things supported Kibbo Kift's belief in the unity of the universe. So concrete and collar studs encapsulate their magical thinking that could make all things magical. And members were told not to underestimate the profound effects that objects can have. Hargrave emphasised it's always been part of the KK method to use material objects, images and symbols and word symbols against all other spells towards world unity. And Hargrave spoke to his inner circle of the magical effects of art as a lure and as a binding. He noted, for example, that some people had joined the Kindred merely because they agreed with the 7 points of the covenant. And they then did nothing further until, he said, the ceremonial discipline began to penetrate and make itself known by means of symbolic art and symbolic action. It made itself known and worked on their imagination. No sooner, he said, were they gradually brought under the symbolic influence of the KK method than they became vitalized and were able to act. And Hargrave was also fond of citing the phrase, resolute imagination is the beginning of all magical operations, attributed to Paracelsus, the 16th century alchemist, who was something of a personal hero to Hargrave and about whom he wrote a book in the 1950s. So Hargrave also spoke about the influence of symbolism on the imagination as casting a spell, and he claimed, I quote, "To bewitch people is my mission in life. It is operative magic." And that magic, always spelt with a K, was the magic of colour and form. So with my art historian hat on, I can't help but hear the resonances in Hargrave's writing with the claims that are sometimes made for the parallels between magical writing and art writing. And as Jamie Sutcliffe has recently noted, that these two genres have significant yet underexplored correlations. Playing as they both do with techniques of invocation, embodiment, and the evocation and manipulation of the symbolic. Likewise, Kibbo Kift's tools and methods, their images and objects, their analogy and their synthesis embody some of the interconnected characteristics of what's sometimes called rejected knowledge, as you well know. And in addition, as a scholar of material culture, I hear striking parallels with 21st century thinking on embodied objects, on objects as agents or actants, and on the vibrant matter philosophies of those such as Bruno Latour and Jane Bennett, who consider afresh the overlooked role of non-human forces or things on political action and in everyday life. Now, these scholars are not arguing exactly for the use of objects as spells in quite the same way that Hargrave and his followers did, but the study of affect and agency in material culture comes strikingly close at times to their definitions of operative magic. So to close with another couple of pages from the Kinlog. Kibbo Kift's visual and material culture was expected to propagate ideas and to change minds. Its abstraction and its symbolism encrypted messages that were intended to produce political transformation. It did not achieve those ends, despite the beauty of its intentions. Its ambitions always surpassed its capacities, despite the unwavering self-belief of members, another kind of magical thinking, perhaps. Its messages were far too cryptic for most people to understand. Despite the broad appeal of many of its core aims for a fairer and more peaceful world, its methods seemed ill-equipped to deliver them. Skeptics could not understand why political reform required a dramatic dress code and a rousing set of songs, much less a ritual book of spells. But for all their obscurity, Kibbo Kift proclaimed and performed the enchanted aspects of the modern world in all of its aspects, from the mud upwards. Thank you.
If you can't see it, then you just never know.